Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the first topic in the new biology syllabus for IB, the 2025 syllabus. The first topic is water. This is similar to the last syllabus, but it's been simplified a little, so it's now easier to understand. So, first, we'll start by looking at water as the medium for life. It's important that you understand that all biological processes require water, and this happens from the micro level, so cells are mostly made of water, to then, for example, the circulatory system. So blood is mostly made out of water, so we see another example where it's really important. And thirdly, at the more macro level, we know that there are organisms that live in an aquatic environment, be that the sea or a river. This on the left is the molecule of water, so we'll look at that in a sec, but it's one oxygen joined by two hydrogens. So moving on, now we need to look at the biochemical structure of water. So water is made of, as I said, one oxygen atom joined by two hydrogen atoms at the sides. Now, water is quite a special molecule. It's not a coincidence that it's so important for life. And this is because the oxygen is bonded to the hydrogen in what is known as a covalent bond. So for those of you who don't take chemistry, who I'm assuming is the majority, a covalent bond requires the sharing of electrons. However, in most cases, this sharing of electrons is not equal. What this means is that one atom pulls the electrons more towards itself than the others. In this case, that is oxygen, which wants those electrons closer to it, leading to the electrons being closer to it and therefore a partial negative charge. And that's what this weird sign over here represents. I'm aware that you've probably never seen this, but it's quite easy to remember. This just means there's a partial charge, be it negative or positive. Since it's the oxygen pulling the electrons, and remember, electrons are negative, the oxygen will have a partial negative charge, whereas the hydrogen will have a positive partial charge. Therefore, this is called a polar covalent bond, because there's a polarity, right? Like a magnet, there's a positive side and a negative side. Okay. So as I said, these are the partial charges. And this leads to quite an interesting property of water. And it's that it can hydrogen bond with each other. So here I've represented three water molecules. And as you can see, they can hydrogen bond to each other. It's very important that you remember how to draw a water molecule and how to draw a hydrogen bond. Remember, the hydrogen will be bound to the oxygen. So a hydrogen can't bind to another hydrogen, and similarly an oxygen can't bind to another oxygen. This is because a negative charge needs to bind a positive charge. This is what we call a hydrogen bond. Bear in mind, this is not as strong as a covalent bond. Actually, it's an intermolecular force, so it doesn't classify as a bond on paper, but we still call it a hydrogen bond. Don't ask me why. That's beyond me. But it's important that you know how to draw this for the exam, as it's a question that comes up quite a lot. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at how hydrogen bonds result in the unique properties of water that make it so suitable for life. So the first property is cohesion. So as we saw before, water molecules bind each other. This means that they stick together in reality. So whenever you see a volume of water, think about the fact that that's millions of water molecules hydrogen binding together to make it a larger volume. So this has biological implications, and you need to remember too. The first is the xylem in plants. You will look at this in more detail in other units, but for now, just know that the xylem is the tube in a plant, right, along the stem through which water travels, and cohesion, so the water sticking together, allows it to go up the stem, right, against gravity. The second example is how some organisms can live on water, and that's because of cohesion as well. Cohesion gives water surface tension, which means that very light animals can live on the water. So if that's clear, now let's look at adhesion. So cohesion and adhesion go hand in hand. Adhesion is the property by which water molecules can stick to other solids made of polar molecules. You don't really need to understand what a polar molecule is in great depth, but it's basically the same idea of the partial charges of the electrons being distributed unevenly. So Water can not only hydrogen bond to itself, but it can also hydrogen bond to other molecules that are polar. In effect, this also has consequences. Back to our previous example of the xylem, it's not only important that the water coheres, right, so it sticks together, but it's also important that it adheres to the walls of the xylem, because that way it can crawl its way up in a way. That's not exactly the reality of how it works, but just so that you understand it now, think about it that way. The cohesion allows the water to stick together, the adhesion allows it to trail up the xylem. And here you can see in this diagram how this is represented, right? So adhesion to the wall, cohesion between each other, and thus the water travels upwards from the roots to the leaves. Okay, so cohesion and adhesion, hope that's clear. Then we have solvent properties. This is very, very important. All hydrophilic molecules dissolve in water. What's a hydrophilic molecule, you're probably asking if you don't take chemistry? Well, they can mainly be classified into polar molecules and ions. So polar molecules, as we talked about, are molecules which have those partial charges, and ions are just atoms with a positive or negative charge. Examples that you might know are sodium or potassium. That polar molecule which I have here is glucose, for example. Why is it important that water can dissolve a lot of molecules? Well, most metabolic processes, so that is processes, reactions that involve enzymes, require for the enzymes to be dissolved in water. This explains why we're mostly made out of water. You've heard that before. This is because enzymes need to be dissolved in water to work, and they carry out almost all processes in the cell. Similarly, for transport, blood, as we talked about in the start, is mostly water. Therefore, it's very useful that molecules can dissolve in the blood, right, so that they can travel throughout the body. Otherwise, it would be very hard to get things around. Think about the fact that oxygen comes in through your lungs, but then has to be distributed throughout the whole body. So this really facilitates that process. All right, then another important property is buoyancy. This is classified under the physical properties. This is a new aspect of the syllabus. So buoyancy, the force that pulls a body upwards from the water. So we've all done this before. You try and put a ball, a football, for example, under the water, it'll go back up, right? Then we have viscosity. I think everyone understands the idea attached to this, right? How much drag there is when you try and move your hand through the water, for example, right, as opposed to air. Thermal conductivity, so this is just how well water conducts heat. And then the specific heat capacity. This refers to the amount of energy it takes for water to rise in temperature, which is quite high, as we will see. So now in this new syllabus, IB wants you to know the differences in these 4 properties between an organism that might live in the water, such as the ringed seal, and an organism that lives on land or in the air, such as the black-throated loon. The black-throated loon is also on the water a lot, but for the purposes of this, let's focus on it being in the land or in the air. So in terms of buoyancy, this is much lower in the air, right, than in the water. So it'll take a lot more energy for the bird to stay mid-air compared to the seal, which is just naturally afloat. In terms of viscosity, it's obviously much harder to move something through the water than through the air, right? So this means the seal requires a lot more energy to move through the water. Similarly, thermal conductivity is lower in the water, which means it's much easier to maintain body temperature than in the water, where thermal conductivity is much higher. So the seal will have to use a lot more of its energy to maintain its temperature. And finally, specific heat capacity is also lower on land, so in the air, than water. So it takes a lot more energy to heat up water than it takes to heat up air. This means that there's much more brusque changes in the thermal environment in the air, so there's more fluctuations in temperature than there is in the water. This is easy to remember. As you can see, all of them are lower in air than in water, so just make sure that you remember this. And for the exam, try and remember the consequence of it, right? So how the adaptations of the animals play a role with these factors, right? Okay. And then finally, We're moving on to quite an unexpected part of the syllabus that I did not see coming, but alas, and it's where did water come from? How is it that it's on Earth? So the main hypothesis is that it came through collision of asteroids. It's believed that many asteroids might have collided, which carried a lot of water, and thus it ended up on planet Earth. And then how was water retained on the planet, right? It could have just evaporated and left the Earth. Well, it's thought that first of all, because Earth is quite a big planet, gravity might have helped in pulling the water back to Earth if it tried to evaporate. And secondly, the sun being quite far away from the Earth relatively would mean that the temperature on Earth would never be high enough for all of it to evaporate, right? So condensation would still play a role and it would go back to the surface. And then finally, they want you to know about the Goldilocks zone. So I don't know if you've read Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but there's 3 platters of soup, I believe. One is too hot, one is too cold, one is perfect. It's the same idea with how do we find planets where there might be life, right? With the assumption that there needs to be water, how can we find the planets where there's water, and how do we know in which ones there's not? And it's the same idea of if the planet is too close to a star, it'll be too hot, and therefore we would assume that water would evaporate, right? So there would be no water on the planet. If it's too far away, then it would be too cold for there to be water, liquid water. And then in the middle, we would expect there to be a Goldilocks zone, right? So that zone where there's the perfect conditions. So it's just right, as it says in the image. And that would indicate that there could be the presence of water and therefore extraterrestrial life. All right. So also, just so you know, these 3 last slides, so the extraplanetary origin and extraterrestrial life are part of higher level. So if you do standard level, don't worry about them. Otherwise, I'm afraid you might have to learn them. And if you have any questions, make sure to let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to answer any. Hope this was useful, and I'll see you next week for nucleic acids.